January 1944, Cerignola, Italy. The cold comes first, not the chill of a winter morning back home in North Carolina. This is a different kind of cold. It seeps through the canvas of the tent, through the sheepskin of the flight jacket, through the skin itself, settling deep in the bone. At 500 hours, the Foggia Plain is a sea of mud and frozen grass, and the B-24 Liberators stand silhouetted against the black sky like great, waiting beasts. 20-year-old Sergeant Louis Blanding Fowler pulls himself from his cot. Around him, the other 9 men of his crew stir in the darkness. No one speaks. There is nothing left to say. They have been here before. They will be here again. The only question is whether they will all come back. By 600, they are trucked out to the hardstand where their ship waits. She is a B-24J. Factory fresh, and the ground crew have painted her name across the nose in careful script. Frenesy, a Spanish word. It means frenzy, but also in the slang of the day a kind of wild, beautiful dream. The men who fly her do not discuss the irony. Fowler climbs into the waist of the aircraft. His position is on the left side, behind a .50 caliber Browning M2. The gun weighs 84 pounds, in the thin air at 25,000 feet. With a frozen trigger mechanism and gloves the size of oven mitts, it will feel like twice that. He checks his oxygen mask. He checks his harness. He runs his gloved hand along the cold metal of the gun. The engines cough, sputter, then catch. One by one, they roar to life, their propellers slicing the dawn air into invisible blades. The noise is absolute. It fills the world. It is the sound of 1,200 horsepower, 4 times over, and it drowns out everything. The fear, the cold, the memory of home. Frenesy lumbers forward, joining the long line of bombers taxiing toward the runway. There are hundreds of them, B-17s and B-24s, stretching across the airfield like a river of olive drab. The sun is just beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and orange, and for a moment, it is beautiful. Fowler looks at the faces of his crewmates, the pilot focused, the co-pilot scanning instruments, the waist gunner across from him, a kid from Ohio whose name he knows better than his own brothers. They are not heroes, they are not warriors, they are just boys 20 years old, flying a machine built by strangers into a sky filled with steel. He didn't know it yet, but before the sun reached its peak, he would be fighting not just the enemy but gravity itself. The machine Sergeant Fowler climbed into that January morning was a study in contradictions. Consolidated Aircraft's Model 32, designated B-24 Liberator, represented the latest thinking in American aviation design and the oldest compromises of industrial warfare. To understand the B-24, one must understand its wing. Designer David R. Davis created a high-aspect ratio airfoil of exceptional efficiency, long, narrow, and elegantly curved. The Davis wing generated enormous lift with minimal drag. It gave the Liberator range nearly 2,850 miles with a bomb load and speed that could reach 303 mph at altitude. In an era when every knot mattered, the B-24 could outrun the B-17 by 20 miles per hour. It could carry more bombs farther than any American bomber then in service. But efficiency came at a price. The Davis wing was designed for speed, at low speeds. With flaps retracted, its performance became marginal, sometimes deadly. Pilots learned to treat their approach speeds with religious reverence, too slow on takeoff, and the bomber would stall, too fast on landing, and the brakes, already inadequate for a 56,000-pound aircraft, would fail to stop it before the runway ended. The men who flew her gave her names that betrayed their ambivalence, the flying boxcar they called her for her slab-sided fuselage that seemed less an aircraft than a delivery truck with wings, the agony wagon, the thundermug, the twin-tailed time bomb. The crate the B-17 came in, some said. It was the unkindest cut of all. The fuselage itself was a marvel of efficient packaging and a nightmare of human engineering, designed around 2 bomb bays, each capable of holding 8,000 pounds of ordnance. The interior was a long, narrow tube. To move from the flight deck to the waist, crewmen had to traverse a catwalk just 9 inches wide, straddling the open bomb bay doors beneath them, at 25,000 feet, with the bomber in evasive maneuvers. That catwalk became a tightrope over oblivion. Defensive armament evolved throughout the war. Early models carried single .50 caliber machine guns in the waist and nose, hopelessly inadequate against head-on fighter attacks that German pilots perfected. Later versions, including the B-24H and J models, that equipped the 15th Air Force, added powered nose turrets and improved tail armament. A well-armed Liberator carried 10.50 caliber Brownings, nose turret, top turret, ball turret, waist guns, and tail turret. It was a flying fortress in its own right, but a fragile one. The engines that powered this massive structure were Pratt & Whitney R1830 Wasps 14-cylinder radials producing 1,200 horsepower each, air-cooled, turbo. Supercharged, they were reliable workhorses, but they demanded constant attention. Oil temperatures, cylinder head temperatures, manifold pressure, RPM, the pilot's scan never stopped. Lose one engine on takeoff, and the bomber would yaw violently. Lose two on the same side, and even two pilots with their feet jammed against the rudder. Pedals might not hold her straight. She had to be handled gingerly, one pilot remembered. Airspeed was critical. Any increase in drag guaranteed disaster. Yet despite her quirks, or perhaps because of them, the B-24 became the most produced American aircraft in history. By war's end, over 18,000 Liberators rolled off 5 production lines. Ford Motor Company alone built 8,685 at Willow Run, a plant that stretched a mile long and turned out a complete bomber every 60 minutes. They came in waves: B-24 CS, DS, ES, GS, HS, JS, LS, MS, each variant addressing the shortcomings of the last. But no variant could address the fundamental truth of strategic bombing in 1944. The men inside were sitting ducks. The B-24's unpressurized cabin meant that at 25,000 feet, the temperature inside matched the temperature outside, often 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Frost formed on oxygen masks, gloves froze to gun grips, the .50 caliber Brownings, reliable in temperate climates, jammed with alarming frequency in the thin, cold air of the stratosphere. Gunners carried hammers to beat the charging handles when rounds failed to feed. The oxygen system was equally unforgiving. A disconnected hose meant unconsciousness in minutes, death shortly after. In one RAF Liberator operating over the Mediterranean, a gunner's oxygen mask froze during approach to target. He collapsed unconscious to the floor. The navigator, at 20,000 feet, filled his own mouth with oxygen from an emergency bottle, placed his lips to the gunner's, and breathed for him rhythm with his fading pulse, while the bomber completed its bomb run. That was the B-24, a machine of brilliant engineering and maddening flaws, a bomber that could carry 8,000 pounds of high explosives to the heart of the Reich, but couldn't keep its gunners warm enough to pull a trigger, an aircraft that production engineers loved and pilots learned to tolerate. By early 1944, the Liberator had become the backbone of the 15th Air Force, based in the muddy fields of southern Italy. From Foggia to Cerignola, the airfields sprawled across the flat plains east of Naples, primitive strips carved from farmland, often underwater after rain, always inadequate for the machines they hosted. The 485th Bomb Group settled at Venosa, the 455th at San Giovanni, the 451st at Casalluccio. They came to bomb the soft underbelly of Europe, the oil fields of Ploesti, the marshalling yards of Vienna, the aircraft factories of Regensburg, the ball-bearing plants of northern Italy, long-range missions that required crossing the Alps in both directions, threading mountain passes where flak batteries waited, enduring fighter attacks from Luftwaffe squadrons still full of fight. The 15th Air Force lost bombers at a staggering rate. 20% was acceptable. 30% happened, 50% over Ploesti, on that terrible August day in 1943. When 177 B-24s took off and only 123 returned, the men who flew those missions knew the odds. They calculated them each morning before takeoff, each evening when the surviving aircraft droned back over the Adriatic, each night when empty bunks in the tents told the story that no one spoke aloud. Sergeant Louis Fowler knew those odds. He had trained for months in Nebraska, learning his .50 caliber, learning to lead a target, learning to clear a jam with frozen Fingers, he had crossed the Atlantic in the belly of a transport, watching the gray water slide by beneath him, wondering what waited on the other side. He had seen his first combat mission and his second and his 10th. By March of 1944, he was no longer a boy from North Carolina. He was a veteran. Waist gunner in a B-24J named Frenesy, part of the 828th Bomb Squadron, 485th Bomb Group, 15th Air Force. And he was about to fly into a mission that would strip away everything but the raw instinct to survive. To understand what Sergeant Louis Fowler carried into the sky that March morning, one must understand who he was before the war and who the war made him become. He was born on August 16, 1924, in Fountain Inn, South Carolina, the youngest of four children. His parents, Dora Dick and James Wiley Fowler, raised him in the quiet certainties of rural Southern life, faith, family, country. They embedded in him what he would later call a fierce love for God and his country, but by the fall of 1942, both parents were gone. Louis Fowler was 18 years old, freshly graduated from high school and alone in a world that had suddenly caught fire. He did not wait to be called, he enlisted. The United States Army Air Forces, it would not become the Air Force until 1947. Needed men like Fowler, not pilots, not officers, but gunners, boys with quick reflexes, steady hands, and the willingness to sit in a plexiglass bubble at 25,000 feet while German fighters shot at them. The training was relentless, at places like Piot Army Air Base in Texas and Davis Mountain Field in Arizona. The 400th Bombardment Group processed thousands of young men through the B-24 replacement training unit pipeline. They learned the .50 caliber Browning until they could field strip it in the dark. They learned to lead a target, to calculate deflection, to clear a jam with frozen fingers while wearing gloves the size of oven mitts. They learned to breathe through an oxygen mask, to recognize the first signs of hypoxia, to trust the man beside them with their lives. Phase I training focused on individual skills. Phase II taught the crew to function as a team. Phase III prepared them for combat operations. By the beginning of 1944, most combat units had already deployed. The training mission had shifted from building new groups to providing replacements for the units that were being chewed up overseas. The men coming through the pipeline were no longer being shaped into a cohesive unit that would train together and fight together. They were being shaped into spare parts, individuals to fill the gaps left by the dead and wounded. Fowler was assigned as right waist gunner. His crew, 10 men in total, represented a cross-section of America. The pilot, likely a college boy from the Midwest. The co-pilot, perhaps an enlisted man who had earned his wings. The navigator, the bombardier, the radio operator, the flight engineer, and 5 gunners, nose, top, ball, waist, tail. They came from farms and factories, from small towns and city streets. They were, in the words of historian Stephen Ambrose, the boys from Main Street, transformed by war into the sharp end of the spear. By early 1944, Fowler's unit, the 828th Bomb Squadron, 485th Bomb Group, had deployed to Italy. The 485th was assigned to Venosa Airfield, a semi-permanent facility carved from the farmland about 6 kilometers east-northeast of the town. The field had been built by Army Corps of Engineers beginning in September 1943 with a single pierced steel planking runway, extensive taxiways, and hardstand parking areas large enough to accommodate a full bomb group. There was a wooden control tower, some Quonset huts for essential functions, and thousands of 6-man tents for the men who flew and fixed the bombers. Life at Venosa was primitive by any standard. The tents had dirt floors. Heat came from 55-gallon drums converted into stoves, burning whatever fuel could be scavenged. Light came from a single dim bulb at the center of each tent. When there was fuel for the generator, water was scarce. Mud was everywhere. When the rains came, the entire base turned into a sea of boot-sucking clay that made movement difficult and maintenance a nightmare. Yet the men adapted. They scavenged wrecked aircraft, Italian and German relics left from before the surrender, for metal to reinforce tent floors, for plexiglass to patch windows, for any useful part that could make their existence more bearable. They learned to live with the cold, the damp, the constant noise of engines being run up and tested at all hours. They learned to sleep through anything and to wake at the slightest change in the rhythm of the base. The 485th Bomb Group began combat operations in April 1944, flying its first missions from Venosa against targets in Italy and the Balkans. By then, the strategic bombing campaign from Italy was in full swing. The Foggia airfield complex, of which Venosa was part, included nearly 24 airfields spread across a 25-mile radius around the city of Foggia. From these bases, the 15th Air Force could reach targets that were inaccessible from England, the oil fields of Ploesti in Romania, the industrial centers of Austria, the marshalling yards of Hungary, the factories of southern Germany, and occupied France. The strategic importance of these bases was not lost on the enemy. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister for Armaments, later wrote, "I could see omens of the war's end almost every day in the blue southern sky when, flying provocatively low, the bombers of the American 15th Air Force crossed the Alps from their Italian bases to attack German industrial targets." But for the men flying those bombers, grand strategy meant little. What mattered was the mission. Each morning they gathered for briefing. Intelligence officers pulled back the curtain on a wall map, revealing the target for the day. Red string marked the route north over the Adriatic, through the Brenner Pass or across the Yugoslavian coast. Then, deep into enemy territory, flak positions were marked, fighter bases were noted. The weather was assessed, and the men calculated their odds. By March 1944, Fowler had flown 13 combat missions. 13 times he had climbed into the freezing waste of a B-24, crossed the Alps, dropped his bombs on target, and returned to the muddy haven of Venosa. 13 times he had watched other bombers go down, flaming comets spiraling toward the earth, parachutes blooming like desperate flowers in the cold blue sky. 13 times he had survived. The statistics said he should not have. The 15th Air Force lost bombers at a staggering rate. Over Ploesti, the losses approached 50%. Over Vienna, they were barely better. The average crew had a 1 in 3 chance of completing their 25-mission tour. Most did not. But Fowler kept flying, kept manning his .50 caliber, kept watching the sky for the specks that would grow into German fighters, coming in fast from 12 o'clock high, guns blazing. On March 19, 1944, the 485th Bomb Group was scheduled for its 14th mission. The target, enemy installations in Austria. 400 bombers would make the journey, weaving through the mountain passes, enduring the flak, fighting off the fighters. For many of those Americans, it would be the last mission of their lives. Fowler's crew climbed into frenzy before dawn. They ran through their checklists. They tested their guns. They waited for the flare that would send them down the runway and into history. The sky above Venosa was clear that morning. The sun rose over the Adriatic, painting the clouds in shades of gold and pink. It was beautiful. It was the kind of morning that made a man believe he might live forever. In the thin, cold air above the Alps, the crew of Frenzy existed in a state of suspended animation. 10 souls sealed inside a vibrating aluminum tube, dependent on each other for survival in a way that civilians would never understand. The pilot sat forward on the flight deck, his eyes moving constantly across the instrument panel. Airspeed, altitude, manifold pressure, cylinder head temperature, engine synchronization. His hands rested lightly on the yoke, not gripping, never gripping, because a death grip meant tension, and tension meant mistakes. Beside him, the co-pilot monitored the formation, watching for the lead ship's signals, scanning for enemy aircraft, ready to take over in an instant if the man beside him stopped breathing. Behind them, the navigator hunched over his table, plotting course corrections with pencils that threatened to slip from frozen fingers. The bombardier checked and rechecked his Norden sight, the most secret piece of technology on the aircraft, though its precision meant little when flak was bursting all around. In the top turret, the flight engineer gunner swiveled constantly, his powered turret tracking the sky above. In the nose, the bombardier doubled as forward gunner, ready to face the most terrifying threat of all, the head-on fighter attack that German pilots had perfected into a killing art. In the belly, the ball turret gunner, occupied the most isolated position on the aircraft. Crammed into a sphere just 4 feet in diameter, he was lowered into position after takeoff, unable to move, unable to escape, dependent on the pilot to raise the gear to free him in an emergency. If the hydraulic system failed, he would be crushed on landing or forced to bail out, rotating the turret by hand until the guns pointed straight down, then falling free through the open hatch above him. In the waist, Louis Fowler stood on the left side, his fellow gunner on the right. Their position was the coldest on the aircraft, a wide open window through which the slipstream roared at 150 miles per hour, bringing with it temperatures that could drop to 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. They wore electrically heated suits beneath their sheepskin jackets, but the suits frequently failed. Frost formed on their oxygen masks, on their goggles, on the guns themselves. In the tail, the loneliest gunner of all sat facing backward, watching the sky through which they had just passed, waiting for the specks that would grow into German fighters, waiting to be the first to see death approaching. These 10 men shared nothing in civilian life. They came from different states, different backgrounds, different worlds, but in the air they shared everything: the same cold, the same fear, the same hope that this mission would be different, that this time the Flak would miss, that this time the fighters would be elsewhere. They were not brothers, they were something more intimate than that. They were crew. The weapon that Sergeant Fowler carried into combat was a masterpiece of American engineering and a brutal physical presence in the already cramped waist of a B-24. The M2.50 caliber heavy machine gun weighed 84 pounds. It fired a cartridge nearly 5.5 inches long, propelling a slug the size of a man's thumb at 2,900 feet per second. At 600 rounds per minute, it could shred an aircraft's control surfaces, puncture its fuel tanks, kill its pilot with a single round through the armor plate. But at 25,000 feet, the M2 became something else entirely. The cold was the first enemy. Lubricants thickened, metal contracted, the bolt moved slower if it moved at all. Gunners learned to work the charging handle with deliberate force, to tap the feed mechanism when rounds failed to chamber, to carry hammers for when tapping wasn't enough. Some carried alcohol to pour on frozen parts, not for cleaning but for melting. The recoil was the second enemy. Firing from an open waist position meant the gun bucked and jumped in its mounting, the gunner's body absorbing forces designed for a stable platform. After a long engagement, shoulders ached, arms trembled, ears rang. Despite the best ear protection the era could provide, the ammunition was the third enemy. Each round weighed nearly 4 ounces. A full combat load of 500 rounds per gun meant 40 pounds of ammunition, plus the weight of the belts, plus the weight of spare barrels, plus the weight of the gun itself. The gunner's position was a small armory, and he was the only one who could keep it functioning. Gunnery training taught deflection shooting, leading the target, calculating speed and distance, placing the rounds where the enemy would be, not where he was. At 300 miles per hour closing speed, that calculation had to be instant. A fighter coming head on covered a mile in 12 seconds. The gunner had perhaps 3 seconds to see it, track it, and fire before it was past. The B-24 carried 10 such weapons, in a perfect formation with every gun firing. Bomber box could throw up a wall of lead that no fighter could penetrate, but formations were rarely perfect. Guns jammed, gunners died, fighters found the gaps. For the waist gunners, the M2 was salvation and burden in equal measure. It gave them a chance to fight back. It demanded everything they had in return. In the cold blue sky above Austria, the Americans were not alone. Somewhere out there, German eyes were watching. By March 1944, the Luftwaffe was no longer the dominant force it had been in 1940. Years of attrition over the Channel coast, over North Africa, over the Eastern Front had bled the fighter arm white, but it was far from beat, and over their own territory the German pilots remained lethal. The Americans feared 2 things above all: flak and fighters. The fighters were worse. German fighter tactics had evolved specifically to destroy heavy bombers. Early in the war, pilots had attacked from the rear and high, the standard pursuit curve taught in every air force, but against the B-17 and B-24's formidable defensive armament, Attacks meant flying through a cone of .50 caliber fire from tail, waist, and top turrets. The losses were unsustainable. Then a young Luftwaffe officer named Egon Mayer changed everything, together with his wingman Georg Peter Eder. Mayer developed a new tactic, the head-on attack. The logic was devastating. Approaching from 12 o'clock high, a fighter presented a minimal target to the bomber's gunners. The nose turret could fire forward, but its field of fire was limited. The top turret could traverse forward, but the pilot's compartment blocked much of its arc. The waist gunners, men like Louis Fowler, could not fire forward at all without shooting off their own tail. In a head-on attack, the fighter pilot had perhaps 3 seconds to acquire the target. Aim, fire, and break away. At combined closing speeds of over 500 miles per hour, 3 seconds was an eternity. The fighter would flash past the bomber formation, cannons blazing, then roll into a splitas and dive away, using speed to escape and reposition for another pass. Mayer became the first pilot to score 100 victories entirely on the Western Front. By the time of his death on March 2, 1944, just 17 days before Fowler's fateful mission, he had claimed 102 Allied aircraft, including 26 four-engine bombers. His tactics were now standard throughout the Luftwaffe's Reich defense units. The Americans adapted. They tightened formations until wingtips nearly touched, creating interlocking fields of fire. They added more guns, nose turrets, chin turrets, cheek guns. They learned to watch the clock, scanning for specks at 12 o'clock high. But the threat never went away. In June 1944, just months after Fowler's mission, the Luftwaffe would demonstrate its continued potency. During raids on Vienna, 1/10 of 550 bombers were shot down, not by Flak, but by the remaining fighter forces around the city, whose pilots were few in number but exceptionally well trained. Those fighters were out there now, climbing to altitude, forming up, waiting for the bomber stream. The target for March 19, 1944, lay deep in the Austrian Alps. Intelligence briefings had been specific: enemy installations, marshalling yards, industrial infrastructure, the kind of target that made a difference, the kind worth dying for. 400 bombers would make the journey. They came from bases scattered across the Foggia Plain, the 485th from Venosa, the 449th from Grotegli, the 451st from Casalluccio, the 461st from Toretto, B-24s and B-17s, climbing in great spiraling circles to form up into combat boxes, then turning north toward the Adriatic. The route took them over the water first, a gray expanse that promised a quick death if the engines failed, then the coast of Yugoslavia, still occupied by German forces. Reminder that anywhere they went down meant capture or worse, then the mountains. The Alps in March are unforgiving. Peaks rose to 12,000 feet, forcing the bombers to thread narrow passes where flak batteries waited. The Germans knew the routes. They had plotted the altitudes, the timings, the likely assembly points. They positioned their guns accordingly. For the waist gunners, the approach was a time of waiting, scanning the sky, checking the guns, watching the mountains slide by beneath. The cold seeped in despite the heated suits. Frost formed on oxygen masks. Men stamped their feet to keep circulation moving, careful not to stumble into the open bomb bay doors beneath them. The bomb bays were full. Each Liberator carried its maximum load, up to 8,000 pounds, of high explosives, fused and armed, ready to drop on command. Below them, the Alps gave way to the flatlands of Austria. Farms and villages slid past, untouched by war, peaceful in the morning light. Then the flak began. It started as black puffs in the distance, cotton balls against the blue, then closer, then closer still, the sky filled with smoke and steel, each burst sending shrapnel tearing through the formations. Gunners ducked instinctively, though there was nowhere to go. The B-24 lurched and bucked as pilots weaved to throw off the gunner's aim. This was the Flak corridor, a gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire laid down by the German Flak Corps, whose batteries ringed every significant target in the Reich. The Germans had organized their air defenses into flexible formations capable of massing fire at critical points. In June 1944, one Flak Corps alone would field 27 heavy batteries and 26 light Batteries over 12,000 men. At Vienna, a ring of anti-aircraft batteries in massive flak. Towers waited for the bombers, their 88 and 105 guns capable of throwing shells to 25,000 feet. It took an average of 5,000 small caliber and 3,400 large caliber shells to bring down one bomber, but when 400 bombers flew through the same airspace, the math changed. The sky filled with steel, some of it would find its target. For the crew of Frenesy, the theory of war ended, and the reality began with a single devastating impact. The formation droned on toward Austria, the Alps falling away behind them, the flatlands of the target region opening beneath, for the men of the 485th Bomb Group. This was the most dangerous moment, the approach to the initial point, where the bombs would be released and the bombers would be forced to fly straight and level, presenting themselves as perfect targets for the guns below. The flak had been building for minutes. Black clouds blossomed in the air around them, each one a fist of steel traveling at supersonic speed. The B-24 bucked and shuddered as shockwaves hammered its thin aluminum skin. In the waist, Louis Fowler gripped his .50 caliber and scanned the sky, searching for fighters that hadn't yet appeared. Then the world ended. It came without warning, a sound beyond sound, a pressure beyond pressure. The flak shell that found Frenesy did not strike cleanly. It detonated somewhere in the belly of the aircraft, tearing through the fuselage like a fist through paper. Shrapnel screamed through the interior, shredding oxygen lines, severing control cables, turning aluminum into jagged knives that flew in every direction. Fowler felt the impact before he understood it. Something hot and sharp tore into his side, his shoulder, his neck. The force threw him against the bulkhead, and for a moment the world went white with pain and shock. When his vision cleared, he saw chaos. The aircraft was dying around him. The intercom crackled with desperate voices, the pilot's comm undercut by urgency, the co-pilot calling out damage reports, someone screaming that the hydraulics were gone. Through the gaping holes in the fuselage, Fowler could see daylight where there should have been aluminum. The wind screamed through the wounds in the aircraft at 150 miles per hour, tearing at everything not bolted down. In the belly turret, the gunner was silent. The shrapnel had found him first. The order came over the intercom, cutting through the chaos with terrible clarity. Bail out. The pilot's voice was steady, the voice of a man doing his job, giving his crew their only chance. The aircraft could not be saved. The only question was who would live. In the waist, Fowler moved on instinct. His training took over. He reached for his parachute, the chest pack that should have been within arm's reach, ready to clip to his harness and take him out of this dying machine. His hand found nothing but empty space. The explosion had destroyed it. The parachute was gone, shredded, vaporized, hurled into the slipstream by the force of the blast. In that frozen moment, 20,000 feet above Austria, Sergeant Louis Fowler understood that he was going to die. The aircraft was falling, the crew was jumping, and he had no way to follow them. He looked around the waist section, searching desperately. The other gunner was gone, already out, already falling toward whatever fate awaited him below. The fuselage was emptying, and still Fowler stood there, harness empty, no parachute, watching his life end in the cold air of the Reich. Then he saw it. In the belly of the aircraft, where the ball turret gunner had sat, a parachute remained. The dead gunner's chute, still in its pack, still intact, still waiting to be used by a man who would never need it again. Fowler did not think, he moved. The aircraft was coming apart around him. The G-forces of the dying spiral pressed him against the bulkhead, making every movement a battle. The wind screamed through the holes in the fuselage, tearing at his clothing, trying to pull him out into the void below him. Through the gaping wound in the belly, he could see the earth spinning, fields and forests and mountains rushing up to meet him. He crawled, he fought. He reached the body of the belly gunner, a man he had known, man he had flown with, a man who would never see home again, and he took the parachute. The harness was unfamiliar, different from the one he had trained with. His hands, numb with cold and shock, fumbled with the clips. The aircraft lurched, throwing him against the fuselage. Below, the ground grew closer. He had seconds, perhaps less. He clipped the harness. He tightened the straps. He did not have time to check if it was Right, he did not have time to think about what would happen if he had done it wrong. Then the aircraft pitched, and Fowler was thrown through the hole in the fuselage, not by choice, not by decision, but by the dying convulsions of the machine that had carried him into the sky. He fell into emptiness. The wind took him immediately, spinning him, tumbling him, robbing him of orientation. In breath, the aircraft receded above him, a dark shape against the blue already. Trailing fire and smoke, already falling toward its own grave. Around him, he could see other parachutes, the white blossoms of his crewmates, drifting down toward an uncertain fate. He reached for the ripcord, his hand found it, he pulled. The parachute deployed with a shock that jerked his entire body, stopping his fall, converting death into survival. Above him, the canopy opened, full and round and beautiful, a miracle of silk and nylon that had belonged to a dead man. Fowler looked up at it. It was shredded. Bullet holes and shrapnel tears riddled the canopy, letting light through in a dozen places. The chute that had saved him was itself wounded, barely holding together under the strain of his weight. He looked down, the earth rushed up. And then he lost consciousness. He woke to silence. The wind was gone, the noise was gone, the vibration of the aircraft, the thunder of the engines, the scream of the slipstream, all of it replaced by an absence so complete it pressed against his ears like water. Fowler opened his eyes. He was on the ground. Snow surrounded him, deep, soft, Austrian snow drifted against the trunk of a tree, cradling him in a cold embrace. Above, through the bare branches, he could see the sky. Blue and empty, no bombers, no fighters, no parachutes. He had landed in a forest, somewhere in the Austrian Alps. The shredded parachute hung in the tree above him, its torn silk fluttering in a breeze he could not feel. His body screamed with pain, the shrapnel wounds in his side, his shoulder, his neck, blood soaked through his flight jacket, freezing in the cold air. He was alive. The realization came slowly, through the fog of shock and blood loss. He had fallen from 20,000 feet in a dying aircraft. He had grabbed a dead man's parachute. He had pulled the ripcord on a canopy riddled with shrapnel holes, and he had survived. The wild gunner had cheated death. But survival was only the first battle. He was alone, wounded, and behind enemy lines in the heart of the Reich. The snow around him held no footprints but his own. The forest held no sound but the wind. Somewhere out there, his crewmates were scattered across the countryside, those who had made it out. Somewhere out there, the Germans were already searching. Fowler forced himself to move. He unbuckled the harness, freeing himself from the parachute that had saved him. He checked his wounds, bad but not immediately fatal. He could walk, he could fight, he could survive. He began to move through the forest, away from the clearing, away from the telltale white silk that marked his landing site. The snow muffled his footsteps, the cold numbed his pain. He walked for hours or minutes. Time had lost its meaning. Then he found the farmhouse. It stood in a clearing, a simple Austrian dwelling, smoke rising from its chimney. Fowler approached cautiously, his training warring with his desperation. The people inside could be Nazi sympathizers. They could turn him in. They could kill him where he stood. But he was bleeding. He was freezing. He had no choice. He knocked. The door opened. An Austrian woman stood there, her face a mask of fear and calculation. Behind her, a man, her husband, perhaps, watched with wary eyes. They saw the blood. They saw the uniform. They understood. They pulled him inside. For 2 days, the Austrian farmers hid the American gunner. They fed him. They bound his wounds. They kept him warm while the snow fell outside and the German patrols combed the countryside. They risked their lives for a stranger, for an enemy, because he was a man in need. But the war would not allow such kindness to last. On the 3rd day, the Germans came. Fowler never learned if someone had informed on his saviors or if the patrol had simply been thorough. What mattered was the door bursting open, the rifles raised, the shouted commands in a language he barely understood. The farmers were shoved aside. Fowler was dragged into the snow. Outside, he saw them, other Americans, other survivors from his crew and from other bombers shot down that day. They stood in a line, hands on their heads, faces blank. With shock and fear, German soldiers surrounded them, their weapons ready, their eyes Hard. Then the shooting started. It was not a trial, it was not an execution. It was murder, cold, deliberate, and summary. The Germans shot the escapees one by one, their bodies crumpling into the snow, their blood steaming in the cold air. Fowler watched his crewmates die. He watched the men he had flown with, the boys he had trained with, the brothers he had trusted with his life cut down in an Austrian farmyard. And then it was his turn. The German officer looked at him. The rifle rose. Fowler waited for the bullet that would end everything. It did not come. Perhaps the officer saw something in Fowler's eyes, defiance, perhaps, or simply the exhaustion of a man who had already died once and was not afraid to die again. Perhaps the Germans had run out of bullets. Perhaps they simply decided that one prisoner was worth more than one corpse. The rifle lowered. A soldier grabbed Fowler's arm and shoved him toward a truck already filling with other prisoners, the lucky ones, the ones who would live to see another day. Fowler climbed into the truck. He did not look back at the bodies in the snow. He could not. If he looked back, he would break, and he could not break, not yet. The truck lurched forward, carrying him toward an uncertain future, toward Stalag Luft. IV, toward months of starvation and brutality, toward the long march through the snow. That would claim so many of his fellow prisoners. He did not know any of this yet. All he knew was that he was alive, and that alive meant hope. The sky had tried to kill him. The ground had tried to kill him. The Germans had tried to kill him. And still, Sergeant Louis Fowler breathed. The truck carried Fowler eastward, away from the mountains, away from the bodies in the snow, away from everything he had known, the wounded gunner from South Carolina, who had fallen 20,000 feet and lived, was now a prisoner of the Third Reich. The first stop was Dulag Luft, the transit camp outside Frankfurt where downed airmen were interrogated. The Germans had perfected this process. They separated prisoners, kept them isolated, let them sit in cells with nothing but time and fear. Then came the interrogators, men who spoke perfect English, who seemed to know everything about the 485th Bomb Group, who casually mentioned squadron commanders and base locations as if they had walked the muddy streets of Venosa themselves. Fowler gave them nothing, name, rank, serial number, again and again. They threatened, they offered cigarettes, food, warmth, small comforts in exchange for small betrayals. He refused. But the body could not refuse everything. The shrapnel wounds in his side, his shoulder, his neck, they festered in the unheated cells. The cold seeped through the thin blanket. The hunger gnawed at his stomach, and in the silence of solitary confinement, the images came unbidden, the belly gunner's body, the shredded parachute, the execution. In the farmyard snow. He would carry those images for the rest of his life. After interrogation, the Germans moved him east again, by boxcar this time, packed with other American airmen, standing for days without food, without water, without heat. The cars were designed for cattle, not men. 40 men or 8 horses, the French called them. 40 men with no room to sit, no bucket for waste, no ventilation but the gaps between the boards. The train crawled across the German countryside, past bombed-out cities and frozen fields, past civilians who stared with hatred or indifference. The men in the boxcars sang. They told stories. They shared the last of their candy bars, the last of their hope. Some died standing up, and the living held them upright until the next stop, when the bodies could be passed out into the snow. The destination was Stalag Luft IV. Located at Gross Tychow in Pomerania, now Tychow, Poland, the camp had opened. In May 1944, just months before Fowler's arrival, it was designed to hold thousands of non-commissioned officers of the Allied Air Forces, sergeants and staff sergeants like Fowler, men who were technically required to work under the Geneva Convention, but whose labor the Germans could not easily exploit. Better to cage them, starve them, let them rot. The camp sprawled across a clearing in the pine forest, 5 compounds separated by barbed wire, each containing wooden barrack huts that housed 200 men. The huts had no insulation, no heat beyond 5 small iron stoves for the entire camp. In compounds C and D there were no bunks at all. Men slept on the floor, packed together for warmth, their breath frosting in the air above them. When Fowler arrived, the International Red Cross had already documented conditions. An October 1944 report described latrines that were open to the elements, washing. Facilities that barely functioned, medical supplies that did not exist, of the more than 7,000 American prisoners, many were already sick with dysentery, pneumonia, tuberculosis, diseases that flourished in cold and filth. The Germans who ran Stalag Luft IV did not merely neglect their prisoners, they brutalized them. The journey from the train station to the camp itself was a 3-kilometer march. Designed to break men before they ever saw a barracks, German guards lined the route. Armed with rifles, bayonets, and dogs, as the prisoners stumbled through the snow, the guards struck them with rifle butts. They bayoneted those who fell behind. They set dogs on those who tried to help their comrades. Captain Henry J. Winson, a doctor who treated the survivors, later testified to what he saw. American and British soldiers arrived with bayonet wounds, punctures 3 inches. Deep slices across buttocks and backs and necks. One man had been stabbed 60 times, another suffered dog bites so severe that he required months of treatment just to walk again. The Germans had a diagnosis for these wounds. They called it sunstroke. Fowler entered this hell and did not break. Inside the wire, the prisoners organized themselves. They ran their compounds like small democracies, elected leaders, Chinese letter, tasks, shared resources, Red Cross parcels arrived. Sporadically, each one a lifeline of chocolate and cigarettes and canned meat that could mean the difference between survival and starvation. When the parcels stopped coming, as they often did, the men tightened their belts and waited. Fowler waited through the autumn of 1944, through the first snows of winter, through Christmas in a frozen barracks with no tree, no carols, no hope of home. He watched men die of dysentery, of pneumonia, of simple despair. He watched others survive through acts of heroism so quiet and constant that no one thought to record them. The man who shared his blanket, the man who carried water for the sick, the man who told jokes when jokes were the only medicine left. In January 1945, the International Red Cross conducted another inspection. Stalag Luft IV now held 8,033 Americans, 820 British, and smaller contingents from Poland, Czechoslovakia, France, and Norway. None of them knew that their captivity was about to enter its most terrible phase. The Russians were coming. The Soviet winter offensive had pushed deep into German territory, and the Nazi High Command, obsessed with keeping prisoners out of enemy hands, ordered the evacuation of all POW camps in the path of the Red Army. On February 6, 1945, the order reached Stalag Luft IV. 8,000 men would march into the unknown. Fowler gathered his few possessions, a blanket, a cup, the clothes on his back. The Germans distributed the remaining Red Cross parcels and told the prisoners to carry what they could. No one told them where they were going. No one told them how long it would take. No one told them how many would die. They marched out of the camp gates into a landscape of snow and ice, columns of ragged men stretching for miles along frozen roads. The guards flanked them, rifles ready, dogs straining at their leashes. Behind them, the barracks of Stalag Luft IV receded into the white distance, empty now, waiting for the Russians who would arrive weeks later and find nothing but abandoned wire and the ghosts of those who had suffered there. The long march had begun. The column moved slowly at first, 8,000 men strung out along a frozen road, their breath pluming in the January air, their feet wrapped in rags and paper and anything else that could provide insulation against the cold. The Germans had given them no preparation, no supplies, no guidance, just the order to march and the implicit threat that those who fell behind would be shot. For Louis Fowler, the march was a test beyond anything the sky had thrown at him. The shrapnel wounds in his side had never fully healed. The months of starvation had stripped away his strength. Each step was a battle against the cold, against the pain, against the temptation to simply lie down in the snow and let the war end. The route wound through the Pomeranian countryside, past villages frozen in time, past farms where German civilians watched with expressions the prisoners could not read. Some threw stones, others looked away. A few, a very few, risked everything to toss bread to the passing men, knowing that discovery meant imprisonment or worse. At night, they slept in barns when there were barns, in fields when there were not. The guards herded them into whatever shelter could be found, cramming hundreds of men into spaces meant for dozens, denying them fires for warmth, withholding food and water as a matter of policy. Men huddled together for survival, sharing body heat, sharing blankets, sharing the last crumbs of Red Cross chocolate hoarded for exactly this moment. Dysentery swept through the column. Men staggered to the roadside, unable to control their bodies, and the guards shot them where they stood. Others simply stopped walking, their legs refusing, their hearts giving out, their spirits finally broken. After months of captivity, the guards shot them too. Fowler walked. He walked through blizzards that erased the road ahead. He walked through thaws that turned the frozen ground to mud, sucking at his feet, pulling him down. He walked on. Bleeding feet, on frostbitten toes, on legs that screamed for rest he could not give. He walked because to stop was to die, and he had not fallen 20,000 feet through the sky to die on a German country road. The column crossed and recrossed the same territory, the Germans apparently uncertain of their destination, their orders, their purpose. They marched east, then west, then north, a confused migration of starving men driven before a collapsing empire. The guards grew more desperate as the weeks passed, more brutal, more erratic. Some deserted, simply walking away into the forest, abandoning their posts to save themselves. Others became more vicious, taking out their fear on the helpless prisoners. By late February, the remnants of the column reached the coast. The destination it emerged was a prison camp in the west, Stalag Luft VIIA at Moosburg, near Munich. Far from the advancing Soviet armies, but between the survivors and that destination, lay hundreds of miles of German territory and a regime that was disintegrating into chaos. The Germans herded the prisoners onto ships, cargo vessels that carried them across the Baltic, through waters patrolled by British aircraft and Soviet submarines. Men who had survived months of starvation, weeks of marching, and years of war now faced the prospect of drowning in the cold sea, trapped below decks in vessels the Allies might mistake for troop transports. They reached the port of Lübeck in early March. From there, trains carried them south. Boxcars again, 40 or 8 again, standing for days again. Some died in transit, others wished they had. Stalag Luft VIIA at Moosburg was a sprawling complex that had once held Polish prisoners, then French, then British, then Americans. By April 1945, it held over 80,000 men, more than it was designed for, more than it could possibly sustain. Starvation was endemic, disease was rampant. The Germans, knowing the end was near, had all but abandoned any pretense of providing for their prisoners. Fowler arrived at Moosburg in the last weeks of the war. He was 20 years old. He weighed perhaps 100 pounds. His body bore the scars of shrapnel, of bayonets, of frostbite, of starvation, but he was alive. On April 29, 1945, the guns fell silent around Moosburg. General George S. Patton's Third Army had been sweeping through Bavaria for weeks, crushing the last organized resistance of the Wehrmacht. On the 29th, advance elements of the 14th Armored Division reached the camp. The German guards, knowing the war was lost, offered little resistance. Some fled into the countryside, others simply laid down their weapons and waited to be taken prisoner themselves. The gates swung open. For the men inside, liberation was not the joyous moment they had imagined. Through years of captivity, it was confusion, exhaustion, the slow realization that it was finally over. American soldiers moved through the camp, distributing food and medical care, organizing transport, trying to process the scale of what they had found. 80,000 men, skeletons in rags, their eyes hollow, their bodies broken, their spirits somehow intact. Fowler walked out of Moosburg into a Germany that was itself a ruin. Cities lay rubble, refugees clogged the roads, the Nazi regime that had tried to kill him in the air, then on the ground, then in the camps, was gone, a memory, a nightmare, a stain on history. He was processed, he was fed, he was given new clothes, he was told he would be going home. And then he waited. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, V-Day, the celebration that swept through London and Paris and New York, the moment the world had been waiting for. In the displaced persons camps and staging areas of Germany, the liberated prisoners. Celebrated in their own way, quietly, privately, too exhausted for joy, too haunted for relief. Fowler sailed for home in June 1945. The ship that carried him crossed the Atlantic, the opposite direction from the one that had brought him to war. He stood on deck and watched the gray water slide by, remembering the boy he had been, the men he had lost, the sky that had tried to kill him. He landed in New York. He took a train south. He returned to South Carolina, to Fountain Inn, to the quiet certainties of rural life, to a world that had gone on without him and could never understand what he had seen. He was 21 years old. He had fallen 20,000 feet. He had survived a POW camp. He had marched through the winter of 1945 and lived to tell about it. He was one of the lucky ones, a word that would haunt him forever. The numbers tell one story: 18,488 B-24 Liberators rolled off American assembly lines by war's end. Fewer than a dozen survive. Today, scattered across museums and airfields, silent monuments to a war that ended 80 years ago, the men who flew them are nearly all gone now, their voices stilled, their memories fading, their sacrifice reduced to statistics in history books. But statistics cannot capture what Sergeant Louis Fowler did on March 19, 1944. They cannot capture the moment when a 20-year-old boy, wounded and bleeding, looked at the empty space where his parachute should have been and refused to accept that his story would end there. They cannot capture the crawl across a dying aircraft to take a dead man's chute. They cannot capture the fall through 20,000 feet of cold Austrian sky, watching a shredded canopy hold together by threads and hope. They cannot capture the farmyard execution, the months of starvation, the long march through the snow. Fowler lived, he married, he raised children, he built a life in the quiet decades after the war, carrying within him the memories that no one else could see. In 2012, at the age of 88, he returned to Austria, to the farmhouse where the family had hidden him, to the forest where he had landed, to the places where his youth had ended and his survival had begun. He stood in that clearing and looked up at the sky, and perhaps for a moment he was 20 years old again, falling through the air with a dead man's parachute above him. He died on October 12, 2015, at the age of 91. His obituary noted his service, his survival, his quiet life. It did not mention the wild gunner. It did not need to. The wild gunner was not wild with rage. He was not wild with desperation. He was wild with something more profound, a primal, stubborn, unyielding will to live, not just for himself, but as an act of defiance against a war that had already taken too much. He fought gravity, he fought the cold, he fought the guards and the starvation and the long march, and he won. The B-24s are gone now. The airfields of the Fallujah Plain have returned to farmland. The men who flew the missions are passing into history, their stories carried forward by children and grandchildren who never knew them as young men in leather flight jackets, standing waist-deep in the mud of Venosa, watching the sun rise over the Adriatic. But the story endures: the wild gunner who fell from the sky and lived, the boy from South Carolina who refused to die, the sergeant who took a dead man's parachute and made it his own. In the end, that is all we have: the stories, the memories, the quiet courage of ordinary men who did extraordinary things because the moment demanded it, and because they could not imagine doing otherwise. Louis Fowler looked into the void, and the void blinked first.